My name is Clara. I'm 32 years old, and this is the story of how my own family tried to steal my dream home right from under me. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel, because this story will shock you. For 8 long years, I worked day and night, sacrificing everything I loved just to buy a beautiful house in the suburbs of Dallas. While my friends were out partying and spending their money on trips and fancy clothes, I was eating ramen noodles and working 2 jobs. Every single dollar I earned went toward my dream of owning my own place. But you won't believe what happened next. When I finally got the keys to my dream home, I thought my parents would be proud of me. I mean, their daughter had just accomplished something incredible through pure determination and hard work. I remember calling my mom with tears of joy in my eyes, telling her I'd finally done it. But little did I know that my success would soon become the source of the biggest family betrayal I could ever imagine. My younger brother Mark had been watching from the sidelines, and he had plans for my house that nobody told me about. Growing up, I always knew I had to work twice as hard as Mark to get half the recognition. While I was studying for exams and working part-time jobs, Mark was playing video games and getting money handed to him by our parents. They always said I was the responsible one, and he was the creative one who just needed more time to find himself. I thought that when I bought my house, things would finally be different. I thought my parents would see that hard work pays off and maybe start expecting more from Mark too. But here's the thing about family dynamics. They rarely change just because you want them to. The same patterns that existed when we were kids were still there when we became adults. My parents still saw Mark as their baby who needed protecting, and they still saw me as the strong one who could handle anything. If you've ever felt like the family scapegoat or the one who always has to be responsible, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Trust me, this story is just getting started, and you're going to want to hear what happened next. Let me paint you a picture of how our family worked when Mark and I were growing up. We lived in a nice middle-class neighborhood where both my parents worked their tails off to provide for us. My dad was a mechanic who often came home with grease under his fingernails and exhaustion in his eyes. My mom worked as a secretary at a dental office, always making sure we had clean clothes and hot meals on the table. They were good parents who loved us both, but somewhere along the way, they started treating us completely differently. From the time I was about 12 years old, I knew that if I wanted something, I had to earn it myself. When I wanted a new bike, I had to babysit the neighbors' kids for months to save up the money. When I wanted to go on the school trip to Washington, D.C., I had to sell candy bars and wash cars to raise the funds. My parents would say things like, "Clara, you're so mature and responsible, we know you can handle this on your own." At first, I felt proud that they trusted me so much, but later I realized it was just their way of not having to spend money on me. Mark, on the other hand, lived in a completely different world. When he wanted a new video game, it magically appeared under the Christmas tree. When he needed money for movies with friends, Dad would slip him a $20 bill without asking any questions. Our parents justified this by saying that Mark was more sensitive and needed extra support to build his confidence. They said I was naturally strong and independent, so I didn't need as much help. Looking back, I can see how this set us both up for problems later in life. The worst part wasn't even the unfair treatment. It was how normal it all seemed to everyone else. When relatives would visit, they'd praise me for being so mature and responsible, while they'd coddle Mark and make excuses for his behavior. "Oh, Mark's just artistic," they'd say when he failed another class. "Clara's got such a good head on her shoulders," they'd say when I got straight A's while working a part-time job. Nobody seemed to notice that one child was being pushed to grow up too fast, while the other was being enabled to stay a child forever. But this family dynamic would come back to haunt us all in ways none of us could have predicted. When it came time for college, the differences between Mark and me became even more obvious. I had been working part-time jobs since I was 16, saving every penny I could for my education. I applied for scholarships, filled out financial aid forms, and even took out student loans to cover what my savings couldn't handle. I knew that education was my ticket to a better life, so I was willing to do whatever it took. Meanwhile, Mark just assumed that college would be paid for, and honestly, he wasn't wrong. Our parents sat me down one day and explained that they had saved some money for our education, but it wasn't enough for both of us. They said since I was already working and seemed to have things figured out, they wanted to give Mark the full ride to college. They promised they would help me later, but Mark needed the support right now to get started. I was hurt, but I wasn't surprised. This was just how things worked in our family. I swallowed my disappointment and told them I understood. Mark went off to a decent state university with all his expenses paid, while I worked my way through community college and then transferred to finish my degree. But here's the kicker. After just 2 years, Mark dropped out completely. He said college wasn't for him and that he needed to find himself through life experiences instead. Our parents were disappointed but still supportive, saying that not everyone is meant for traditional education. They never once mentioned how I had worked so hard to get through school or asked if I needed any help. While I was grinding through my final years of college, working nights and weekends to pay for everything, Mark was bouncing from job to job. He tried being a barista, then a retail worker, then he got into some multi-level marketing scheme that our parents had to help him get out of. Every few months, he'd have a new passion or a new business idea that would definitely make him rich. But whenever these ventures failed, guess who was there to catch him when he fell? You guessed it. Mom and Dad were always ready with emotional support and financial assistance. But watching all this happen was preparing me for what would eventually become the biggest betrayal of all. After I graduated college with my business degree, I was determined to make something of myself in the real estate industry. I started as an assistant to an established realtor, learning everything I could about the business. I worked long hours, studied for my real estate license, and slowly started building my own client base. While other people my age were going out to bars and taking vacations, I was showing houses on weekends and studying market trends at night. My goal was simple. I wanted to own my own home before I turned 30. Every month, I would put aside at least 30% of my income into my house fund. I drove an old Honda Civic that broke down regularly, but I refused to get a car payment because that money needed to go toward my future home. I bought generic groceries, rarely ate out, and my idea of entertainment was free events in the park. My friends thought I was crazy for living so frugally, but I had a vision that kept me motivated. I could picture myself walking through the front door of my own house, knowing that every sacrifice had been worth it. By the time I was 28, I had built up a solid reputation in real estate and was making good money. I had also saved up enough for a down payment on a modest home in a nice neighborhood. I spent months looking at properties, driving through different areas, and imagining where I wanted to build my life. When I found the perfect 3-bedroom craftsman-style house in a quiet suburb of Dallas, I knew it was the one. The house had character with its original hardwood floors and a front porch that was perfect for morning coffee. The day I closed on my house was one of the proudest moments of my entire life. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office, signing all those papers and getting the keys handed to me. I drove to the house alone and just sat in my car for a few minutes, staring at what I had accomplished. This wasn't just a house. It was proof that hard work and sacrifice really do pay off. I called my parents from the driveway, expecting them to be as excited as I was. They congratulated me, but something in their voices seemed distant, like they had something else on their minds. Little did I know, they were already making plans that would turn my dream into a nightmare. While I was busy making my mortgage payments and turning my house into a home, Mark was still living his same old pattern of failure and rescue. He had moved back in with our parents after his latest business venture fell apart, something about selling imported jewelry that turned out to be fake. Our parents welcomed him back with open arms, saying he just needed time to figure out his next move. Meanwhile, I was working overtime to afford my mortgage, property taxes, and all the little expenses that come with home ownership. But I loved every minute of it because it was mine. Mark would call me sometimes, usually when he was feeling sorry for himself or when he needed someone to listen to his grand plans. He'd tell me about his latest idea for getting rich quick or complain about how unfair life was to him. I tried to be supportive, but honestly, it was hard to listen to someone complain about their problems when they'd never really tried to solve them. He'd say things like, "You're so lucky, Clara, everything just comes easy to you." Easy? I wanted to laugh, but instead I just changed the subject. What really bothered me was how our parents would talk about Mark's situation like it was temporary, like he was just going through a rough patch. But this rough patch had been going on for almost 10 years at this point. They'd say things like, "Mark is trying to find his passion," or "Not everyone is cut out for the corporate world like Clara." They made it sound like I was some kind of robot who didn't have dreams or feelings, while Mark was this sensitive artist who just needed more understanding. If you've ever had to watch someone get endless second chances while you worked for everything you got, make sure to like this video and subscribe because you know how frustrating this can be. The breaking point came about 6 months after I bought my house. I was at a family barbecue, and Mark started talking about how he was thinking of becoming a life coach. A life coach. This is a guy who couldn't keep a job at Starbucks for more than 3 months. Our parents were nodding along, saying what a great idea it was, and how Mark had such good insight into people. I just sat there thinking about how I was working 60-hour weeks to pay for my dream home while listening to someone who'd never accomplished anything talk about coaching other people. But little did I know, this was just the beginning of what would become the most shocking betrayal of my life. Living in my dream house was everything I thought it would be, but it also came with challenges I hadn't fully prepared for. The mortgage payment was manageable, but then there were property taxes, homeowners insurance, utilities, and maintenance costs that seemed to pop up every month. The beautiful hardwood floors needed refinishing, the charming front porch needed new boards, and the vintage windows were gorgeous but not very energy efficient. I found myself working even more hours just to keep up with all the expenses. Some nights I'd sit on that front porch I loved so much, drinking coffee and looking at my budget spreadsheet on my laptop. I was house poor, which means most of my income was going toward keeping the house running. I couldn't afford to go out with friends very often, and I definitely couldn't take any vacations. But every morning when I woke up in my own bedroom, in my own house, I reminded myself that it was all worth it. This was what I had worked so hard for, and I was determined to make it work. The real problem came when the air conditioning system broke down in the middle of a Texas summer. The repair guy told me it would cost $4,000 to replace the whole unit, and that was money I just didn't have sitting around. I had to put it on a credit card and figure out how to pay it off over the next year. Then the roof started leaking during a heavy rainstorm, which meant another $3,000 I hadn't planned for. Suddenly, my dream home was starting to feel like a financial nightmare. I started having trouble sleeping because I was constantly worried about money. What if something else broke? What if I lost a big client and couldn't make my mortgage payment? I had worked so hard to get this house, but now I was starting to wonder if I had bitten off more than I could chew. I didn't want to admit to anyone, especially my family, that I was struggling to keep up with the costs. But as the months went by, it became harder and harder to ignore the fact that I might need to make some serious changes. And that's when my family decided to drop a bomb that would change everything. After 8 months of struggling to keep up with my mortgage and all the unexpected expenses, I finally had to face the truth. I was drowning financially, and something had to give before I lost everything I had worked for. I made an appointment with a financial advisor to get a professional opinion on my situation. She looked at my income, my expenses, and my debt, and her advice was clear but heartbreaking. I needed to sell the house before I ruined my credit and lost it to foreclosure. The conversation with my financial advisor was one of the hardest moments of my adult life. She explained that I was what they call house poor, and that continuing down this path would only lead to financial disaster. She showed me the numbers. If I kept the house, I'd likely be bankrupt within 2 years. But if I sold it now, I could pay off my debts, rebuild my savings, and buy something more affordable in a few years. It made perfect sense on paper, but my heart was completely broken. I spent weeks going back and forth, trying to find any other solution. Could I get a second job? Could I rent out a room? Could I refinance? I explored every possible option because the thought of giving up my dream home was almost too painful to bear. But every path I looked at led to the same conclusion. I had to sell. The house that represented all my hard work and sacrifice was going to slip through my fingers, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Finally, I called a real estate agent and put the house on the market. I didn't tell my family right away because I was too embarrassed to admit that I couldn't handle what I had taken on. I figured I'd wait until I had a buyer and then break the news to everyone at once. The house sold faster than expected. Apparently, it was priced right for the market, and there were multiple offers within the first week. I accepted an offer that would allow me to pay off my mortgage, my credit cards, and still have a little money left over to start fresh. But I still hadn't told my family what was happening, and that turned out to be a huge mistake. 3 days before my house sale was supposed to close, my parents called and asked if I could come over for a family dinner. They said they had something important to discuss and that Mark would be there too. I figured maybe they wanted to talk about Mark's latest career idea, or ask me for advice about something. I never could have imagined what they were actually planning to tell me. When I got to my parents' house that Sunday evening, everyone seemed a little nervous. We ate dinner and made small talk, but I could tell something was going on. Finally, my dad cleared his throat and said they had an announcement to make. My mom was smiling, Mark was grinning like he'd won the lottery, and I was just sitting there waiting to hear what was so important. That's when my dad dropped the bombshell that would change everything between us. "We've been talking as a family," my dad said, "and we think it's time for Mark to have some stability in his life. We know you have that big house with extra bedrooms, and we think it would be perfect for Mark to move in with you." My mom chimed in, saying how it would be good for both of us. Mark could help with expenses, and I could help him get back on his feet. Mark was nodding along, talking about how excited he was to finally have a nice place to live, and how he'd definitely contribute to the household. I sat there in complete shock. Not once had anyone asked me if this was something I wanted, or if it would work with my situation. They had made this decision without me and were presenting it as a done deal. Mark was already talking about which room he wanted, and how he could set up his computer for his new online business idea. My parents were talking about how proud they were that their children would be supporting each other. And all I could think was, do they have any idea what I'm actually going through right now? But I was about to give them a reality check that none of them saw coming. I took a deep breath and looked around the table at my family, all of them smiling and excited about their plan. For a moment, I considered just going along with it to avoid conflict. But then I realized that staying quiet would only make things worse. They needed to know the truth, and they needed to hear it now. So I put down my fork, looked directly at my parents, and said the words that would change everything. "I'm sorry, but that's not going to be possible because I sold the house 3 days ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Mark's face went from excited to confused to angry in about 3 seconds. My mom dropped her fork and just stared at me like I had spoken in a foreign language. My dad was the first to recover, asking me to repeat what I had just said because surely he had misheard me. When I confirmed that yes, I had sold the house and the closing was in 2 days, the room exploded with questions and accusations. "Why didn't you tell us?" my mom demanded. "How could you make such a big decision without talking to your family?" Mark was furious, saying I had ruined everything and that I was being selfish and spiteful. My dad was asking if there was any way to back out of the sale, if we could contact the buyers, if there was anything that could be done to fix this situation. But I just sat there calmly and let them get it all out, because I knew they needed to hear the whole story. When they finally quieted down, I explained my financial situation. I told them about the broken air conditioner, the leaking roof, and all the other expenses that had been drowning me for months. I explained that I had consulted with a financial advisor who told me that selling was the only way to avoid bankruptcy and foreclosure. I looked directly at Mark and said, even if I had kept the house, I couldn't afford to support another person. I was barely keeping my head above water as it is. But instead of understanding or sympathy, what I got next was something that showed me exactly who my family really was. Mark was the first to explode, and what he said next revealed the entitled attitude that had been building up for years. "This is all your fault," he shouted. "You're just trying to spite me because you're jealous that Mom and Dad wanted to help me get back on my feet. You've always been selfish, Clara, always putting yourself first." He went on to say that I should have talked to the family before making any decisions, that we could have worked something out together, and that I was ruining his chances at finally getting his life together. My parents, instead of defending me or trying to understand my situation, immediately started brainstorming ways to fix Mark's problem. My mom suggested that maybe I could use the money from the house sale to help Mark get his own apartment. My dad wondered if I could co-sign a lease for Mark, or maybe give him some of the proceeds as a loan to get started. They were literally asking me to use the money I desperately needed to rebuild my own financial stability, to bail out my brother who had never worked for anything in his life. "You don't understand," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'm not keeping much money from this sale. After paying off my mortgage, my credit card debt, and the real estate fees, I'll have just enough to move into a small apartment and start over. There's no extra money to help anyone else." But Mark wasn't having it. He accused me of lying about my finances just to get out of helping him. He said I was probably keeping the money for myself and using debt as an excuse. The conversation kept getting worse, with my parents pressuring me to find some way to help Mark and Mark accusing me of deliberately sabotaging his life. Finally, I'd had enough. I stood up and said something that I had been thinking for years but had never had the courage to say out loud. You know what the real problem is here? You've spent Mark's entire adult life rescuing him from his own bad decisions, and now you expect me to do the same thing. Well, I'm not going to enable him anymore. If you've ever had to set boundaries with family members who expect you to fix everyone else's problems, make sure to like this video and subscribe because you know how hard this conversation can be. But what I said next was going to change our family dynamic forever. I looked directly at my parents and continued. Do you realize that by constantly bailing Mark out, you've prevented him from learning how to handle his own problems? He's 30 years old, and he's never had to face real consequences for his choices because you're always there to catch him when he falls. My mom started to interrupt, but I held up my hand and kept going. When he dropped out of college that you paid for, there were no consequences. When he quit job after job, you gave him money to get by. When his business ideas failed, you helped him pay his debts. My dad tried to defend their actions by saying that Mark was struggling and needed support, that family helps family, but I wasn't done. You're right, family should help family, I said. But helping someone and enabling someone are two completely different things. Helping would have been encouraging Mark to stick with college, or refusing to give him money unless he kept a job for at least 6 months. Enabling is what you've been doing, removing all consequences from his actions so he never learns to be responsible. Mark was getting angrier by the minute, accusing me of being jealous and bitter. You've always resented that mom and dad love me more, he said. That comment hit me like a punch to the gut, not because it was true, but because it showed how completely delusional he had become. Mark, I said, this isn't about love. This is about the fact that you've never had to work for anything in your life, and now you expect me to hand over my house to you just because our parents think it's a good idea. I turned back to my parents and said something that I knew would be hard for them to hear. By always rescuing Mark, you haven't just hurt him, you've hurt me too. Do you realize that I've never once asked you for help as an adult? Not when I was struggling through college, not when I was saving for my house, not even when I was drowning in expenses these past few months. And you know why? Because I learned early on that in this family, I'm the one who gives help. I don't receive it. The room went quiet, and I could see that my words were finally starting to sink in, but I wasn't finished yet. Over the next few weeks after that explosive family dinner, something interesting started to happen. For the first time in his adult life, Mark had to face a situation where he couldn't rely on our parents to solve his problems for him. With my house out of the picture, he had to figure out his own living situation, and our parents finally started to see what I'd been trying to tell them about enabling him. It wasn't an easy transition for anyone, but it was necessary. Mark initially tried to guilt our parents into letting him stay with them indefinitely, using all the same tactics that had worked for years. He talked about how unfair life was, how I had ruined his chance at stability, and how he just needed a little more time to get back on his feet. But something had changed in my parents after our confrontation. Maybe it was finally seeing how their different treatment of us had affected both their children. Or maybe it was realizing that Mark was 30 years old and still acting like a teenager. My parents sat Mark down and gave him an ultimatum that was probably 20 years overdue. They told him he could live with them for exactly 6 months, but only if he got a job, any job, within 2 weeks and started paying them rent. They also made it clear that this was his last chance to get his life together with their help. If he couldn't prove that he was serious about becoming a responsible adult, he would need to find somewhere else to live. Mark was shocked because our parents had never set boundaries with him before. Amazingly, when faced with real consequences for the first time in years, Mark actually rose to the challenge. He got a job at a local electronics store within a week and started paying our parents' rent. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady income. And for the first time in a long time, Mark seemed to have some purpose in his life. He even called me a few months later to apologize. Not a full, heartfelt apology, but at least he acknowledged that he had been expecting too much from me. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and it showed me that people really can change when they're forced to face reality. After the house sale closed, I moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment across town. It was a huge step down from my dream house. No hardwood floors, no charming front porch, no character at all, really. But you know what it had? Peace. For the first time in almost a year, I could sleep at night without worrying about mortgage payments or unexpected repair bills. My rent was affordable, utilities were included, and I finally had some breathing room in my budget. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The apartment was small, but I made it cozy with some plants and artwork that I had been storing in my old house's garage. I bought a comfortable reading chair and set it by the window where I could watch the sunset while I planned my financial recovery. Every month, instead of struggling to make ends meet, I was able to put money back into my savings account. I started sleeping better, eating better, and I even had enough extra money to occasionally go out with friends again. It was a completely different way of living. Looking back, I realized that my dream house had become a nightmare of financial stress that was slowly destroying my mental health. I had been so focused on the idea of homeownership as success that I had ignored all the warning signs that I was in over my head. The apartment taught me that sometimes taking a step back isn't failure, it's wisdom. I was building a more sustainable life for myself, one where I could actually enjoy my surroundings instead of constantly worrying about them. The best part about my new living situation was that I had money left over to start planning for the future again. I opened a high-yield savings account and started building up an emergency fund so that I'd never be caught off guard by unexpected expenses again. I also started researching smaller homes in up-and-coming neighborhoods where I could potentially buy something more affordable in a few years. This time, I would be smarter about my decision and make sure I could truly afford whatever I bought. My dream of homeownership wasn't dead, it was just better informed. The months following our explosive family dinner brought changes that none of us had expected. My parents, who had spent decades treating Mark and me so differently, finally started to see how their parenting choices had affected both of us. My mom called me one day and said something I had been waiting my whole life to hear. "Clara, I'm sorry we put so much pressure on you to be the responsible one while we babied your brother. We thought we were helping both of you, but we can see now that we weren't being fair." My dad had an even harder time admitting that their approach had been wrong, but eventually he came around too. He told me that watching Mark actually succeed when given boundaries made him realize how much they had been holding him back with their constant rescuing. "We thought we were being good parents by protecting Mark from failure," he said, "but we were actually preventing him from growing up." It was a difficult conversation, but it felt good to finally have my feelings acknowledged. The relationship between Mark and me also started to improve, slowly but surely. Once he got settled into his job and started building some confidence through his own achievements, he became less defensive and angry. We started having normal conversations again, instead of the tension-filled interactions we'd had for years. He even asked me for advice about managing money and setting career goals, something he never would have done when he was used to having everything handed to him. Our family dinners became much more balanced affairs. Instead of Mark dominating the conversation with his latest scheme, while I sat quietly being the responsible one, we actually started talking to each other like equals. My parents stopped making excuses for Mark's behavior and started celebrating his small victories at work. They also started asking me about my life and goals instead of assuming I had everything figured out and didn't need support. For the first time in years, I actually looked forward to family gatherings because they felt like real relationships instead of performances where everyone played their assigned role. So here's what I learned from this whole experience. Sometimes what looks like the end of a dream is actually the beginning of something better. Selling my house felt like failure at the time, but it turned out to be one of the best decisions I ever made, not just financially, but emotionally too. I learned that I had been so focused on achieving this symbol of success that I had lost sight of what actually makes life good: financial peace, healthy relationships, and the freedom to make choices without being crushed by debt. The most important lesson, though, was about boundaries. For 32 years, I had been the family member who absorbed everyone else's problems while pretending I didn't have any of my own. I had enabled my family's dysfunction just as much as they had enabled Mark's irresponsibility. When I finally stood up and said no more, it forced everyone to face reality and grow up. Mark had to learn to be responsible. My parents had to learn to treat us equally. And I had to learn that setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's necessary for healthy relationships. Looking back, I can see that my family's plan for Mark to move into my house wasn't really about helping him. It was about continuing the same pattern that had been going on for decades. They wanted to solve his problems in a way that didn't require him to change or them to stop enabling him. My financial crisis and the house sale forced us all to confront these patterns and finally break them. Sometimes life has a way of pushing you toward the changes you need to make, even when you're too scared to make them yourself. If you're dealing with family dynamics that feel unfair or toxic, I want you to know that it's okay to set boundaries, even when people don't understand or support your decisions. It's okay to prioritize your own financial and emotional well-being over other people's expectations. And if you've been the family scapegoat or the one who's always expected to be responsible for everyone else, remember that you don't owe anyone your dreams or your peace of mind. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel if this story resonated with you, because we all deserve relationships based on respect and equality, not guilt and obligation. What would you have done in my situation? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video where I'll share more stories about family drama and setting healthy boundaries.